Okay. It's December 18th right now. I'm just going to shoot this shit and edit it down into a cohesive documentary style. Apologies if this is not up to par at this point. That is okay. I got the idea for this project from my medieval religion and culture professor, Dr. Dean, who is responsible for me becoming a religious studies major. So huge shout out to that guy, taking all of his classes. And the first one I took, medieval religion and culture, he talked about ergot poisoning in our conversation about mystical experiences during the medieval ages. And he mentioned it as a possible explanation for some mystical experiences, but didn't blanketly claim that all mystical experiences are caused by ergotism. And in fact, the vast majority of them aren't. However, by the sheer amount of people that have contracted ergotism and how common it was before we have the food security that we have today, it is exceedingly probable that one of the mystical experiences documented during that time was caused by ergotism and just a specific reaction to ergotism. So, what is ergotism? Ergotism is a illness caused by eating fungus that grows on grain, particularly rye. It loves to grow on rye. Ergot is the fungus, and it has within it a sister compound to lysergic acid diethylamide, the psychoactive drug known as LSD. And the compound within ergot is known as lysergic acid amide. So you can see how they're quite similar, just one molecule difference. There are many accounts from the medieval era as well as the modern era of people eating bread sourced from grain described in a way consistent with ergot contamination. And after eating this bread, people would experience hallucinations, would start violently convulsing, and if they were very unlucky, develop a sort of dry gangrene because ergot acted as a vasoconstrictor, and so on the extremities, skin would just decay and atrophy away. Most of the symptoms that were experienced by people was the bad stuff. There's a reason why it's called St. Anthony's Fire. People if ergot essentially will hijack the nervous system and make it spasm in all sorts of uncomfortable ways. And that is if you're lucky enough not to get the gangrenous version of it where your skin just peels away. I wanted to make note of this interesting thought too, because of the way that that ergotism will force you to spasm, as described. It is thought to be a cause behind the 1518 Strasbourg incident of mass hysteria, where everybody started dancing and couldn't stop for weeks. And to add to the misery of the disease, the hallucinations that people would mostly experience were hellish in nature, that demons were out to get them, or they were imminently going to be cut up or whatever. But there are some accounts, especially in the modern fascinating case study of the 1951 ergot poisoning of a French town I'm not going to attempt the name of. And in this case, there were many people experiencing hallucinations of grandeur similar with people that are schizophrenic and might think that they have some sort of divine purpose here on Earth. And I owe this next bit to the YouTuber James Greer, who made a fascinating, in-depth video on ergotism, where he mentions the very trippy look that the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch have from this time period. If you look up like his most famous one, the triptych, The Garden of Earthly Delights, like it's very the way that he chooses to portray demons and angels and all of that as objects that sort of have become possessed is very similar. I've taken psychedelics before in Minecraft, and I would say that that is very typical of what an actual psychedelic experience is like. It's not in terms of visuals. It's not that you are completely transformed into another dimension, irrecognizable from our own. Rather, you are seeing the dimension you're in kind of come alive in a way that is not very describable. There's a scene in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas that's very good at trying to get at what I'm describe here. But then, the trippy nature of Hieronymus Bosch's paintings makes you wonder, is it possible that because we're talking about a pre-modern, or the very, if you depending on how you look at it, like the very beginnings of the modern era, but we're talking about a time before food security, like where we have synthetic fertilizers that basically allowed for the billions of people that we have today. Before then, depending on how temperate the farming season is, food yield can range wildly, and some years people would eat anything, even if it has little black specks in it, which are consistent with ergot, because they're starving. The modern example, 1951 France, occurred for a similar reason of just trying to maximize the amount of food production. A miller admitted to using some low quality grain to make some flour that he noticed had a unusual consistency, which he chose to sell to the local baker anyway, who also noticed that the flour had a weird consistency but just chose to make bread out of it anyway. And then poisoned and killed a few people in the town. Ergotism is something that can easily occur if you're cutting corners in food safety, which obviously really didn't exist in the medieval times. How does all of this relate to mystical experiences and otherworldly journeys? Well, in the 1950s, when psychedelics were first starting to be experimented with, at this time they were not classified as any sort of illegal or illicit substance. So professors and academics were sometimes experimenting with these substances. Timothy Leary is probably the most notable or the most famous, whatever one. And but one that really is applicable to this conversation is Walter Ponk, who famously did a Good Friday experiment, or the Marsh Chapel experiment, where he took 20 students and divided them into a couple groups. One group got a placebo drug, another group got active psilocybin. They then went to a church service where the group who had received the psilocybin universally reported a heightened level of spiritual experience. Now, bring this into the context of ergotism in the medieval ages, and it all starts to become clear why we have instances of not just mass hysteria, but like mass paranoia. the Salem witch trials, or just like any witch trial anywhere, honestly. Um, if psychedelics make you have a heightened religious experience, then what would a psychedelic experience be like that is horrifying, like the like ergotism often was, and then combined with the religious conservatism of the time period? If everybody around you was going crazy, you were losing your mind, and you were watching people with rotting limbs that are falling off, then you would also assume that there's a maleficent being out there that's poisoning the well. But there are some that would have had a tremendous experience on it. For whatever reason, sometimes people just didn't get that sick and may have only just experienced the hallucinations as a side effect. And if those hallucinations were not of the demonic type that people often describe, they were usually of the opposite, which is the grandeur like type that I kind of mentioned earlier. And for those people, they must have gotten experience that is like none other from the medieval world. If you had no idea what psychedelics were and you had a psychedelic experience, and you had a positive psychedelic experience, you would absolutely think that you're having some mystical experience designed by God.